Recording? Okay. So my name is David Ellis. I'm a doctoral researcher here. I study the philosophy of religion, mainly the overlap between religious beliefs, experiences, and ethics, with a keen eye on the role of language. Today, we are going to be taking a look at morality and determinism. If anyone has any comments or feedback or any questions, please get in touch with me. My email address is david.ellis@bangor.ac.uk. So feel free to drop me an email. Or you can find me on Twitter at daveellis95. I put up a lot of philosophy and religion resources there. And also, when this recording is going to be uploaded on a website we're designing especially for this purpose, I will be advertising out the link and all the information through Twitter, as will Josh and as will Gareth. So be sure to keep in touch. So today we are looking at morality and determinism. The order of today, the general plan that we have, is we are going to first take a look at free will. Now, some of you might have already had a session on free will this week. There's been a few sessions done with the department. Perhaps some of you are already quite familiar with free will, but it's important to recap what free will is in order to really be able to appreciate what determinism is. So we'll briefly take a look at free will. We'll then have a look at the moral dimension, because what we're going to be looking at today is not just determinism, but the ethics of it, the morality of it, why it morally or ethically matters. So we'll have a look at that moral dimension. Then we'll take a look at determinism, and we'll be able to better appreciate it in relation to free will, but also because we've started the discussion on that moral level, we'll be able to quickly access why it actually really matters. From determinism, we'll see if there is a possible middle ground. We'll take a look at compatibilism. We'll also take a look at fatalism, which is a view that a lot of you are probably already aware of, but you might not know the technical name for it. So it's always worth just take a quick look at that, and then we will summarize and have some take-home messages. And as I say, there will be 5 or 10 minutes at the end left for you all to perhaps ask me some questions, or to let voice some opinions, some ideas, and hear what my views are on it. Or perhaps I might be able to offer you some guidance. So, free will. Free will is, in the view of David Hume, the most contentious question of metaphysics. So already we have a bit of an indication of the sort of discussion we're having here. It's a contentious one. It's widely contested. It's widely debated. Even at the time of David Hume writing, and this was the 1700s, the question about free will was a popular one, a heated one, and it does still remain as such. But it's a question of metaphysics. So what do we mean by that? Metaphysics is the study of the nature of things. What is stuff made of? What sort of stuff does exist? How does it exist? If someone says, do numbers exist, for example? If somebody says that there is no end to space, what does that mean? Is there an end to space, or is space sort of circular? The metaphysicists ask those sorts of questions, and they all work with scientists and mathematicians. So at the point of writing, David Hume was trying to point to our focus on the topic of free will in a particular way. There was a warning that it's contentious and that we're assessing it metaphysically. So how did he define free will? Well, David Hume wrote that free will is the power of acting or of not acting according to the determination of the will. So as you can see, I've highlighted 2 aspects of this quote. The power of acting or of not acting. So what Hume is saying here is there is a distinction. There's a distinction between being able to do something and choosing to do it. The power of acting or not acting. So if you want to walk, are you able to walk? If you want to go to work, are you able to go to work? An essential aspect of free will, Hume holds, is the ability to act out what you want. But that then points us towards the second crucial element to free will, that you can do what you want and not necessarily what other people want, that it's your decision. If you want to go to work, you can go to work. So there's two components. Have you got a free choice? Have you got a free decision? And once you've made up your mind, you know what you want to do you have the power to do it? But it's not just doing things, it's also not doing things. If you don't want to do something, are you able to freely choose to not do it? And then are you freely able to stay at home and not go anywhere? So there are two elements, acting out and choosing what to act. So he continues, he says, that is, if we choose to remain at rest, so if it's your choice to stay in bed all day, well, then you can. No one's going to drag you out of bed. Your body isn't going to betray you. You know, you might be saying, I really want to stay in bed, but beyond your control, your body might just start getting up out of bed and start walking around against your will. That would be a weird sort of situation. But that's why the dichotomy exists. There is what you will, and then there is what you do. You need both to be conforming under your control to have free will. That is David Hume's conception. If you choose to move, you also may move. Now, Thomas Hobbes, he has a quite similar definition. He agrees. He says a free agent, a person with free will, is he who can do as he wills. So if you want to do something, you can do it. And forbear as he will. Forbear is an archaic way of saying you can restrain yourself. You can hold back. You can fight back an urge. If your urges are controlling you, you don't really have free choice anymore. We might start to say a person can't help themselves. They can't control themselves. They keep running their mouth off and getting themselves into trouble all the time. And we start to say, well, they don't really have free choice anymore because they can't hold back. So he's trying to draw out the importance of what David Hume was also saying there. But there's an element of Hobbes's quote that I've highlighted. Liberty is the absence of external impediments. So Thomas Hobbes agrees totally with David Hume. A free agent is someone that you can do what you choose to do. You can hold back. If you don't want to do it, that's your choice as well. Fine, total agreement. However, there is a third element. Are you in a state of liberty to be able to carry out those things? He says liberty is the absence, the lack of external constraints. So I might have the free choice right now to go and buy a particular item. I physically can go get up and walk to the shops to go and buy that item. But due to lockdown restrictions, I'm not able to purchase certain items. That third element is the point Thomas Hobbes points out. It's your choice to go and buy a new PlayStation. You can physically go to the shops and try to buy one, but is there an external force, an external body preventing you? The state, the government, the market, the police, something like that. He says that that is an essential aspect of what we mean by freedom. If there is an absence of it, you're free. If you're not, if there isn't that absence, if there are people telling you what you can and can't do and putting a gun to your head, you're not free at all. So what's all the fuss about? This sounds quite obvious. You have free will. If it's your choice, you can act it out and no one's stopping you. What is all the fuss about? Well, the fuss really comes down to how this influences morality, ethics, and values. It's important to notice that these things are widely agreed on by a range of very different philosophers, as we're about to see. But this holds real, personal, immediate consequence to your life right now. This isn't just a classic sort of textbook classroom problem where we all sort of come to class, learn about it, and forget about it when we go home. It isn't that. Your very life will radically alter depending on your opinions about free will and determinism. Everything changes. It is that of a contentious, that of a heated debate. So let's see. Jean-Paul Sartre Some of you perhaps have had a session already on existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre being perhaps one of the most famous of the existentialists. He writes in his essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, which you can find for free online. He writes, man is condemned to be free. So here he asserts that you have freedom, but it's condemnation. You're condemned to it. When we think of freedom, we often think of daisy chains, having a nice little skip in a forest, having a nice little walk down the park or a beach, freedom being this lovely, nice, desirable thing. His point is, no, freedom is an abyss. There is no constraints, no absolute rules, no absolute laws, no real consequences to your actions. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no God, there's no sin, there's no right, there's no wrong. Everything is created by the individual. So he's saying that freedom is the total lack of these external impediments. And he says we're born into a world where there is a total lack. Sure, there is the environment and the weather and stuff like that. When we talk about justice, when we talk about purpose, meaning, responsibility, all of that is a product of humans. So that's where he writes condemned, because he did not create himself. You did not decide, there's no guidebook to your existence. You didn't plan to be born. You found yourself thrown into existence, yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does. So what he's saying here in a very powerful way is that you do have freedom. You are free. You are at liberty. And with that comes unavoidably responsibility. So if you have freedom, if you have free will, you have moral, ethical, value-based responsibility, because all of these ideas come from you and me. Justice doesn't exist out there in the world. We've decided to create it and decided to agree to it and to live in accordance to it. So if we have free will, then we do have this moral responsibility. So this is starting to fuel the discussion. But Sartre wasn't sort of alone in thinking this. He was writing in the early 20th century. I mean, he was actually writing in Nazi-occupied Paris, for a bit of context. Hence, a lot of his views being very much about freedom, very much about that dramatic, because it reflects his own experiences. Immanuel Kant, however, who wrote 100, 200 years beforehand, he wrote that duty commands nothing but what we can do. So this is a very different sort of reasoning. Sartre was talking about something very personal, reflective, very existential, funnily enough. Kant's point in Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason emphasizes that if you have a duty to do something, then it is only true if and only if it's possible for you to do it. You cannot have a duty to do something which is impossible. I can't say that you are obliged to grow some wings and fly around this room right now, and if you don't, you're a bad person. We'd say that's unreasonable. That's not fair. You can't expect me to do things which are impossible. And that's expect me to do it. Never mind command me to do it and say there is an obligation to do it. So Kant's point is, if there are moral obligations, if there are moral duties about not killing people, about the duty you have to your partner or to your children or to your parents, these duties only exist if it is possible for you to do it. So what's the cost here? The cost is that if you can't choose whether to do it or not, it's not down to you whether you will or will not abide by those duties. I could just be telling a mountain that it has the duty to turn to fire or to turn into ice. But we would say I'm being irrational, I'm being crazy. The mountain can't control that. I'm a fool for telling it to do it. I'm also a fool for thinking that the mountain is listening and is able to change its mind and act in accordance to what I'm saying. In the same way, I would be a fool to tell you that you must do these particular things if you turn around and say, I'm like the mountain. I have no choice. I have no control. I can't help myself. I cannot not do this particular thing. So this then starts to get us to notice the costs of this discussion. Sartre is arguing that if you have free will, then morality inevitably comes. You create it. On the other hand, Kant is saying if you do not have free will, if you can't have choice or control, well, then you're not obliged to do anything. There are no duties. There is no commands. There are no rules that you can be held accountable to, because you'll turn around and say, I could not have helped myself. And we're like, oh, that sort of gets a big, big problem in morality, in ethics, in justice, in democracy. What is having a free vote if you can't actually choose who you want to vote into power? There is no choice. Determinism, in one way or another, leads to that consequence. And that's why the debate is so heated and contentious. Determinism is the view, more or less, we'll see how some factors cash out slightly differently, but determinism is a view that every action is in consequence of a previous action. That everything you're doing right now is the effect of previous causes. You coming here, listening to this, was determined by previous things beyond your control. Everything is determined. Determinism, however, takes different forms. There are different forms throughout history. There are different forms from different philosophers. There are different forms from different traditions of philosophy and also religion. Not all religions believe in free will, or at least not in the same way, and we're going to see how. One of the classic views of determinism, often known as classical determinism, is that everything is like clockwork, that everything is the equivalent of a spring or a cog or a dial. It's not in control of itself. It moves when other things around it move. And you might think that you're free. You might think that you have control and choice, but no, you don't. You are being moved around by all the stuff around you, the physical stuff, the physical, tangible world, perhaps less physical stuff, social conceptions, obligations, responsibilities. In fact, even your belief that you have free will has been determined by external things around you. Even that wasn't under your choice, under your control. A second view is that our actions are motivated by external things. These could be external things in the world or external things outside of the world. We could be the playthings of the gods, for example. That might be somewhat of an idea we find in some Norse religions, for example, where people would fight and they would believe that the gods have already decided who's going to live or die, but there may be a degree to which you could choose to die honorably or not honorably. That varies from culture to culture. A third view is that our actions are limited to our values. So it's got less to do with what science can show about evolution and genetics and all that. It's got less to do with gods and beliefs, but it's got far more to do with things such as your values, your desires. You will only ever do whatever you think is the best. You would never do something which you think is bad. And as a result, you have no free choice. You will only do whatever you think is the most important thing, the most valuable, what your desires, your preferences tell you. So we will look at each of those positions with reference to different philosophers, and we'll also see how each position holds a different ethical consequence. There is, however, it's worth bearing in mind, a gradient to determinism. You have hard and soft determinism. Hard determinism is, as you can probably see with the indication there, it is the hard, strong view. Absolutely no free will at all. Everything is determined. Everything. Your dreams. in both senses of that term. When you go to sleep and you are dreaming, every aspect of that dream was determined by other things. Or likewise, what your ambitions are for the future, those sorts of dreams are also not under your control. They've been determined. Soft determinism holds a lesser degree. It says, you know, there are a lot of constraints, but there is maybe some degree of freedom. Or perhaps determinism is true in certain situations, perhaps not in others. Perhaps determinism is true for particular things in the world, but not other things in the world. Fatalism. Now, this is a slightly different position. Fatalism is the view that the future has already happened. So, you know, everything has been predestined, has been written out by God or whatever. It's already been judged, and there's nothing we can do about it. Or you could be that much of a determinist that you could believe that everything that is going to happen could be worked out if we totally understood history. Because if it's cause and effect, then if you understand the nature of the cause, you understand the nature of the effect. So if you understand what all the causes were like, we'll be able to predict with 100% certainty what is absolutely going to happen tomorrow because it's been determined. And in that view, well, the future has essentially already happened, it's already occurred. And that then is a fatalist idea, slightly different. You see, the determinist doesn't think the future has already happened. They just think that what you're doing right now was determined by prior things. The fatalist seems to suggest, no, the future has already been planned. Fate exists. And then there is compatibilism. This is a view that determinism and free will are not at odds. They can actually coexist. They are compatible views. So it's a bit of both. And we usually see that this depends on context, depends on circumstance. So we're going to take a look at each of these positions. So Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is an archetypical example of a hard classical determinist. He goes so far as to not merely say that we don't have choice, we don't have free will. He says free will is absurd. Talk about free will is nonsense, meaningless. People talk about it all the time, but none of them are making even a lick of sense. And he's a classical determinist. So he holds that clockwork image of the world, a robot image of the world, something more mechanical, something more perhaps scientific would be his attitude. And that then leads us to hard determinism. There's no free choice whatsoever. This attitude developed whilst there was a strong move towards science across the board at his time of writing. I mean, across the board in medicine, biology, astrology, even astrology, not necessarily astronomy, but areas which were previously believed to have been purely religious were themselves beginning to adopt scientific methods to try to either stay contemporary, to adjust because it might have been considered useful. So science began to develop every aspect of the human understanding of the world, of the environment. And it began to show that we are a part of it. We're not a special, unique, magical exception. We are as much an object in the world as is a table or a stone or a tree. And studies into disease, into health, into behavior, into mathematics, into gravity, all these things began to reveal to people that there is so much that we don't even experience in our day-to-day lives because they're invisible or they're so small we can't see it. B, we cannot control any of it. And C, we're totally at the whim of it all. We can't control disease or illness. We could try to treat it, but we can't really tell the germs to stop doing what they're doing. This view then began to develop into the idea of a mechanistic. Everything is influencing one another, and no one and nothing is an exception to this. And with that view, Hobbes wrote in his work, Leviathan, which is a political piece. A free subject, a free will or any free. So any talk about anything being free, a free will, free choice, free decision, free agent, free subject, a free spirit, any talk like that is nonsense. You see, free from being hindered by opposition. Remember what he was saying earlier on, that if there is an external force acting on you, if the government's telling you what you can and can't do, if there's someone got a gun to your head saying, I'll kill you if you do it. If you talk about that and saying, I'm not free from oppression, I'm not free from violence, I'm not free from tyranny, then you're making sense. That's a meaningful use of the term. But talking about free will, a free spirit, a free choice, a free life, when someone talks like that, I should not say that he was in error, that he was making a mistake, but that his words were without meaning, that he was just absurd. It was nonsense that was being spoken. So that then is the very strong, hard determinist view. But how can we better understand this idea of being free from being hindered by opposition? So one of the examples which is given is, imagine that you want some apples, and so you go to an apple orchard to pick some. However, on arrival, you discover that they had all been stolen, or that a guard is preventing you from entering. At this point, Thomas Hobbes says, well, it makes sense to say that you're no longer free, as in able to fulfill your desires or action. Now it makes sense to talk about free, but any other talk about freedom, as in it was your free choice to fancy some apples on that day, or that it was your free choice to then fulfill that desire and go and walk, that's nonsense. That wasn't your choice. That wasn't your decision. That was your hunger commanding you to act. That's how you have evolved, perhaps. So where are the moral sorts of implications of this? Well, O'Neill writes in his work that institutions and individuals can have obligations if, but only if, they have adequate capabilities to fulfill or discharge those obligations. Very much the same as what Hobbes was trying to point out, that not just you as a person, but an institution, a business, a government, a country, they can only be held to account and say, you're obliged to fulfill this contract, you're obliged to fulfill this law, or to fulfill this promise or this duty, only if they have the adequate capability to fulfill or discharge that obligation. If they can't do it, then we can't hold them accountable for not doing it. It weren't their fault. It weren't their choice. They couldn't have done otherwise. That is then why there are such huge moral consequences to if determinism is the case. If determinism is true, then it wasn't your choice. You couldn't have helped but do what you did. And is it fair to hold you accountable anymore? So Hobbes argues that you can be considered free if you're free from things like blackmail or tyranny or theft of violence, threat of violence, manipulation, ignorance, or other forms of injustice. You can be free if you're free from them. If you have nothing hindering you, then you, in your natural state, which is determined, is as free as it gets. And that's that. And this could be a pretty bleak picture, of course. And that, again, is why there is so much moral, ethical consequence to this discussion. Moving away from Hobbes and toward Leibniz, Leibniz provides a different sort of way to understand determinism. So where Hobbes was trying to point, he's still be very rational-based, reason-based, he was nonetheless pointing to developments in science, to politics. He had a strong interest, of course, about those external forces acting on you. The state, the citizens, the mob, justice, those principles. Leibniz was somewhat less interested in those aspects when talking about determinism. That's not to say he didn't write about it. He was an absolute genius. He wrote about all sorts. But the feature we're going to look at is the principle of sufficient reason. So this begins with the idea that it wasn't just science that was beginning to reveal how beyond control the universe is, how actually normal we are, how much of an animal and not some magical, special, unique thing, that we're just a collection of atoms. And it wasn't just science that was providing us this mentality. Reason, logic, mathematics, methods of deduction, all of these institutions, all these methodologies were starting to show that we are as susceptible to the laws of motion as everything else is. And if we're talking about actions, then we're talking about motion. We're talking about movement. We're talking about a force that is acted upon an object at rest to prevent it from remaining at rest. An object at rest remains at rest until an external force acts upon it. If you have just got up and stopped resting, the idea is, well, there must have been an external force. So even our choices then, our actions, our desires, everything, all of it must have an account beyond us. So how does the principle of sufficient reason work? Well, it starts off with a general, perhaps common sense observation. Things don't happen at random. Things don't pop into existence from nothing, out of nowhere. And stuff doesn't suddenly change from one thing to another thing just on a whim, without any explanation. Random stuff does not occur like that. There seems to be a rational order. There's a consistency, a structure, a regulation, a nature to everything, a conformity to everything. And so Leibniz writes that if something exists, then there are two types of existence it could have. It could exist out of necessity. So it cannot not exist. It has to exist. So if we're familiar with like cosmological arguments and things like that, we would say God would be an example of that. The uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, that which does not need an explanation for its existence because it has always existed. It exists out of necessity. And Leibniz points out, well, something either exists because it's immortal, eternal, infinite, always forever present, or there is a sufficient explanation to account for how it has came into existence. So it's either always been there or it hasn't always been there. I haven't always been here on Earth. There was a point in time where I never existed. But I don't just pop into existence out of nowhere for no reason, without any explanation. There must be an explanation for my existence, and I can't explain it myself. The explanation needs to exist before I did, as in my mum and my dad existed before me. The explanation, the account for my existence is independent to me and prior to me. And that's the main point. Prior to me. This is not just true to my physical existence, but to my personality, my characteristics, my opinions, my beliefs. I haven't always believed what I've believed. I've changed my mind. I was born into this world not even knowing English, so there was so much I could never have known. And the point is always here, there must be an explanation for why you came to hold that belief. And it must be separate to you. It must come before you and independent to you. You see, if my action was necessary, so let's say I stabbed someone, and it was necessary that I stabbed them, that I could not have stabbed them, it would have been impossible for me to have not stabbed them, well, then we'd say it's determinism. That's determinism. I had no choice. But on the other hand, if my action was contingent, that is to say, it didn't have to happen, but has an explanation for its happening, which is independent to it and prior to it, then that wasn't my choice. That wasn't my control. I can't control what things influence me, external to me, independent to me, prior to me. That's determinism. It's a cause. It's independent to the effect. It's before the effect. It causes the effect, cause and effect. That's how it works. So this is another way to work out determinism, where it's less about that scientific analysis of the universe, although you can do that, but it's just with reason. It either always had existed, it always was, it either always was the case, or it weren't. If it always was the case, well, there was no choice. It couldn't not be. There was no choice. Or if it was once not the case, but now is, well, there needs to be an explanation for it. The explanation comes before it and is independent to it. That's the cause. That's cause and effect. So we can work out determinism through reasoning. So that's Leibniz's position. So where is the moral significance of this? Well, Cicero writes this is a translation from 1856, but he wrote this, I believe it was in the 1st century. So this is, nearly 2,000 years old. That's how long this discussion's really been going on for. He writes that promises are not binding when the performance is impossible. So if you promise to pay someone money or promise to keep a secret, the promise does not actually hold. The promise isn't a legitimate one, a real one, when it'll be impossible for you to live up to it. It will be impossible for you to keep it. So if it is of necessity that you are always going to break the promise, then you can't make one. It's not under your control. You don't know what's going to cause you to tell the truth or tell a lie or reveal a secret or keep a secret. If you can't control that, if you're not in charge of that, well, it's not really binding. It would only be binding if it was possible for you to always choose to keep the promise. But if in an alternative world, it is logically necessary that you always keep the promise, that's just fortunate. There's no guarantee that that will happen for every other promise or for every other person. So only if we all have free choice are we all able to always choose to keep our promises. That is the only occasion when promises can be binding for all people at all times. That's why free will then would be essential. See, this is all, it might be quite dense and difficult to work out, and it is, but this is how the reasoning works, rather than perhaps scientific analysis. It is impossible for you to control whether or not to break your promise. If you cannot control that, then you cannot be held accountable to keeping or breaking it. Promises just mean nothing now. And that's a huge, huge deal, of course. The final form of determinism we're going to take a look at is with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is a very interesting philosopher, both as a person. He had a very, very interesting life, but also his philosophy is also quite different, very different indeed, from the works that we've looked at just previously with Hobbes and Leibniz. Schopenhauer holds a form of hard but continental determinism. So he too, like Hobbes, believes that free will is absurd, it doesn't exist, it's impossible, it cannot exist. But he is a continental philosopher. Continental is a term that we give to philosophies which are characteristically from mainland Europe and have a particular style, a particular methodological approach, a particular subject study, where analytic philosophy tends to be more scientific, like Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, Anthony Flew, those people. Continental philosophy tends to be far more existential, so Sartre or Schopenhauer or Nietzsche and people like that, who are there's a different approach there. And what's interesting to see is even in that different approach, there are still determinists. There is still the heated ethical debate that's going on behind the scenes. What makes it continental then here, and with Schopenhauer specifically, is there is less of a focus on Newtonian physics, about an object at rest remaining at rest until an external force acts upon it. There's less of a focus on the rationality of laws of motion or of mathematics or sufficient reason. And there's more attention placed on things like self-control, forbearance, is what Hobbes called it earlier on. Self-control, your values. Can you control your own motives? Can you really rule your own preferences? Schopenhauer writes, you can do what you will, but in any given moment of your life, you can will only one definite thing and absolutely nothing other than that one thing. So to break this down, you can do what you will. If you want to go to work, you can go to work. If you want to eat a burger for dinner, you can go and eat a burger for dinner, unless you're being prevented to, of course. So you could do what you will. But at the moment in time where you decide, I really fancy a cup of tea, you could never have fancied any other drink at that point in time. You were only ever going to want tea. That's Schopenhauer's point. The things you desire, the things you want, are beyond your control. So you will only ever do what you want the most, and you cannot control that aspect of your life. So for example, you can't choose to be sad or happy. If you're depressed, you can't suddenly change your mind and go, you know what, I want to become happy, please. Beyond your control. You can't do anything about it. Likewise, you can't choose your own sexuality. That's not to say that a person can't have various sexualities or the sexuality change throughout their life. Obviously, they can. There are arguments to show this. But it's more the point that you can't just choose to fall in love with someone, or choose to stop loving someone, or choose to have a child. You can't just decide it and make it happen. Likewise, you can't control those urges, those preferences. You can't tell yourself to be happy, tell yourself to no longer feel hunger, tell yourself to no longer be upset by these sorts of things. So you might be able to have the ability to act out what you want, but you have no control over the things you want. You don't know what you want. Hell, I don't know what I want. For the most part, when I think about my life, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing, nor why I'm doing it, nor what I'm really trying to achieve. And yet here I am still doing it anyway. Schopenhauer's point is, even if you did know what you want, if you did know what you're doing in your life, you wouldn't be able to change it. And if you did, that change was also beyond your control. So again, another very gloomy picture, but we can see why this is so important, not just for applied ethics, applied justice, but understanding your own life, understanding your own meaning, your own responsibility, your own purpose. So it's really fueled. And we find Verras right about this, arguing that an agent at a given time has an objective, pro tanto, in total obligation to do only what the agent at that time has the ability and opportunity to do. So this is in somewhat mirroring other views we've been seeing, that on every occasion you only have a duty to uphold an obligation, promises are only binding, a institution or an individual can only be held accountable. This whole conception of what you could be held accountable to doing morally, legally, politically, democratically, only holds, only binds if you have the ability to do it and the opportunity. Schopenhauer might say, you might have the opportunity. If you want a burger, you may well have the opportunity to go out and get a burger. All right. But do you have the ability to not want a burger? And he says, no. You can't change your mind about things like that. So this leads us then towards fatalism. Fatalism can be understood colloquially as the view that it was meant to be. Things happen for a reason, perhaps. But not just that things happen for a reason, but that they happen for a rational reason. So this is not exactly the same as determinism. See, determinism is the view that everything which currently happens could not have been otherwise because it was determined by prior and external causes. So for example, I could be a determinist and say, everything that's happening now, I can't control. That's not to say the future has happened. The future hasn't happened yet. There is no future. There is no God who's planned it all out. If someone predicts that in 2 weeks such and such will happen, nonsense. Such and such hasn't happened. A fatalist, on the other hand, would either hold the view that the future has already occurred, the gods have willed it, the fates have weaved it. You can have that sort of religious idea, or in another sort of way, it is unavoidable. It's predestined, it's predetermined. That we don't know how we're going to die, but you certainly and definitely are going to die. Logically, it's impossible not to die, would be the fatalist view. And that itself is a contentious point, of course. So there are religious and rational forms of fatalism. Importantly there, the term rational is not to imply that the religious are irrational, not at all. It's to try to emphasize that rather than referring to revelation or religious modes of evidence, we would be referring instead to perhaps mathematics, scientific or logical based modes of reasoning. So religious is perhaps the most obvious examples. Take, for example, the Mayans, who would believe that the world would end. And we can, cut some semantic lines. Was that a religious belief? Was their calendar based on astrology or astronomy? But nonetheless, similar with Abrahamic faiths, we have the book of Revelations that prophesies the end of the world. There is views perhaps in Hinduism that there will be the ninth avatar of Vishnu, Kalki, will come on the white horse. There will be a destruction and recreation of the world. We're currently in Kali Yuga. So we have different stages of the world before destruction. The fates of the god decide. You get the picture. The religious view here for fatalism is very much that the future has either already happened or has already been determined by the gods. The script's been written, we're acting it out. The rational side would be that someone could be that strong and hard of a determinist that they believe that the first cause was the cause of the final effect. That is to say, if everything that's happening right now is the effect of prior causes, then if we totally understood what those prior causes were and were like, we would have been able to predict what we would be doing right now. We would have been able to know in advance what we would be doing. So if we understood everything that's happening right now and everything that's led up to it, we will know for 100% certain what's going to happen tomorrow, and we will not be wrong. And so although the future might not have already happened, it cannot be avoided. We see the first domino fall, and although this one over here hasn't yet fell, we can see it and we know it's going to, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. So that would then be the fatalist conception. So perhaps after hearing all this gloomy sort of stuff, you might be thinking, is there a middle ground? Potentially. Compatibilism tries to offer this. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible. They can overlap, they can coexist. It's not one or the other. A hard determinist says nonsense. They're incompatible and determinism is true. A soft determinist would be a person who'd say they seem to be compatible, but sometimes they are, but on other occasions they're not. There are some things which you do have a free choice about, and there are other things you don't. You have no choice about whether or not you were going to be born or who your parents were going to be. That's determined. That's beyond your choice. But you can choose how you will treat your parents, how you will respect them or not respect them. That then might become the compatibilist view. So compatibilism, as an analogy, can be understood like you're the captain sailing a ship, and you cannot control the waves or the wind or the weather, but you can control how to respond and react to those external factors. You could raise or lower the sails. You could turn port or starboard. You could pull out a compass and have a look at the stars, which are also determined, but through an understanding of them, try to better navigate yourself in your own life. So that would be a compatibilist view. This looks good. It lets us avoid a lot of problems. It sounds nice on paper, but it becomes quite difficult to try to prove that this is really true beyond it just be a sort of wishful thinking. This sounds so appealing because the determinism, the determinists would argue, sound A, so likely to be true, and B, so bleak. You don't want it to be true. You're desperate for it to be wrong, but you don't want to deny all the evidence they have. So compatibilism tries to allow you to accept all the evidence of determinism, but be able to maintain a sense of agency, a sense of freedom and responsibility. That won't be a cynical representation, but that is nonetheless a popular response to the compatibilist viewpoint. But it also emphasizes that our understanding of free will and determinism is so charged, so emotionally fueled by identity, responsibility, meaning, purpose, morals, all these things, that the discussion about what is true can very quickly become sort of mixed up with the discussion of what we would want to be true or what we would not want to be true. So that's a very important thing to consider when you're getting towards that deeper, more sophisticated understanding of the topic. So wrapping things up, determinism then is the view that every action was the result of a prior and external cause. Your choices, decisions, opinions, beliefs, the entirety. And we've seen three ways that could be done. Hobbes had quite a mechanistic, perhaps scientific view that we're a cog in a machine. and we move when the other stuff moves. We think we have freedom. We don't. We have no free will. But the machine could be working or the machine could be broken. If someone came along and smacked the machine with a hammer, well, then we can talk about freedom. The machine is not at liberty to continue functioning. You're not at liberty. A prisoner, for example, a prisoner sat in a cell has potentially free choice. They could choose to do stuff. They could get up and walk around and do some stuff, but they're not at liberty. They're being prevented from going out and seeing friends and family, or robbing banks, or donating money to charity, or whatever they want to do. There is an external force hindering them. Hobbes believes it makes sense to talk about freedom like that, but free choices and all of this, no, you're a machine. You're about as free as an insect. You're not free at all. Leibniz looked less at the scientific view, more at mathematics, reason, and rationality, and asserted that your action would either be necessary or contingent. It's not necessary because there's a point in time when you didn't exist, and so there's a point in time when you weren't acting, so we know it's not necessary. So it's contingent. An explanation for it rests external to you, independent to you, and prior to you. That's a cause. And Schopenhauer thought, this is all well and good, but forget about all of that. The stuff that motivates you, the fuel that you put in your engine, you can't control any of it. You can't control what annoys you, what upsets you, what makes you laugh. Those are things that make you act, and you can't control them. They control you. And so we're determinist in that viewpoint. As we can sort of see, if determinism is true, then it seems like moral responsibility, to say the least, is greatly diminished. If I point at you and say, you should not have done that, and you turn around and say, I had no choice, it's impossible for me to have done otherwise. It feels like a lot of wind has gone from beneath my sails when I start talking about justice, and I'm going to punish you because you did something wrong, when really it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped yourself. It becomes quite difficult. Then how can we be held to account for our actions if we cannot control them? And that's not just holding one another account, holding ourselves to account. Sometimes we let ourselves down and we beat ourselves up for it. But if determinism is the case, you're always going to have let yourself down. Now, is that a positive thing or a negative thing? It's negative to think, this was always going to be bad. But then the positive side is, well, it could have been otherwise. So you couldn't have stopped it if you tried. So don't go thinking that you failed. It was inevitable that this would happen. And this then enters into an odd discussion about, well, how do we interpret this? What do we think? But that's why it's so contentious. That's why it's so charged. And clearly then this question has paramount importance to our life, our liberty, law, democracy, morality, and everything in between. So that's why the discussion matters, how it works, and why the ethics of it is so entwined that at times it can be quite difficult to actually pick it all apart. So before I open up for a couple of questions, if we should have enough time, just want to remind you all to get in touch with me if you have any feedback, questions, comments, whatever. I'm always more than happy to receive any feedback, to have a bit of communication with you. You can drop me an email at david.ellis@bangor.ac.uk. Likewise, you can find me on Twitter, DaveEllis95. I post up a lot of resources on there. When the website becomes active with all the content uploaded, we'll be advertising all of it on Twitter. So feel free to follow us, keep in touch. Also, if you found this interesting and you're interested in continuing your education in philosophy and religion, which I'd really recommend, of course, it might interest you to hear that our department is having some open days, virtual open days, on the 7th of November and the 6th of December, and they are free to attend. So we'll leave the recording there, and we've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone would like to ask any questions in the chat box, please feel free.